The first section of this workshop today is entitled The Evolution into a System for Person-Centered Decisions Making that Transforms Healthcare. So that's a really long title, and I want to unpack it a little bit. But first I want to tell you a little bit about myself and how I came to be involved with this work. So I'm trained in internal medicine, practiced a little over 20 years in hospital-based medicine. And through my years in practice, I observed that patients and families weathered a healthcare crisis very differently. Some weathered it better than others, and it seemed that there was a theme that families who talked about stuff that really mattered on a daily basis and they were just connected in a different way, weathered a crisis differently and better and more intact. Likewise, I observed that there were physicians that when interacting with patients and families in crisis could really be healing and helpful, and there were others that actually kind of made it a little bit worse and harder. So after that reflection and trying to learn from it through practice, I then transitioned into successive leadership roles in a large integrated health system, Spectrum Health, in West Michigan. And part of my area of responsibility was the amazing privilege to help lead our advanced care planning program and subsequently our shared decision-making and serious illness program. And so through that professional experience, I learned that there were actually words and a program to describe what I had observed in practice, and that there was an ability to make a difference. And so I came to then think of those families that struggled and those doctors that made it worse as avoidable suffering, because there's a way to prevent it. And so then I had the great fortune of being able to take a career change and join Respecting Choices in the beginning of this year. And so through that professional journey, as well as some personal experiences that I'll share with you, is sort of my story, my why, that I am very, very invested in this work. So in this title and in this workshop, what I'm going to unpack is a little bit more about the evolution of the Respecting Choices terminology of how we're now describing the work that really always has been Respecting Choices, and talk a little bit more about what do we mean by person-centered decision-making. That's kind of a new term, and want to really help to illustrate what that is. So you'll see me use some of the exact slides that Stephanie used this morning. In part, repetition is good when we're learning new things, but in part, I want to use our time together to really look into that a little bit more deeply and use some stories to help illustrate those concepts that at this point are a little bit abstract. And then last, I'll talk a bit more about what do we mean by transforming healthcare? What does it mean to transform a culture? That sounds big and missive and sort of messy, and so to talk a little bit more tactically and strategically about that. So as you heard Stephanie describe this morning, Respecting Choices is now a division of CTAC Innovations. You could sort of think of CTAC Innovations as the implementation arm that really works with organizations to help pick up and implement person-centered care. And CTAC's mission is certainly very well aligned with Respecting Choices. And Respecting Choices began at Gunderson Health System over 25 years ago, where initially advanced care planning programs were developed and implemented and tested, and then systems were designed to help lift that and help other organizations across the world and internationally replicate that work. And at that time, Respecting Choices really was known as a system of advanced care planning with a base of evidence through study and research, as well as a long history of reflecting on real experiences. And so the contrast from evidence-based practice to also including what I call practice-based evidence, which means reflecting and learning from real life, even though it may not be a double-blind placebo-controlled study, is still worthwhile. And so in 2017, when Respecting Choices transitioned from Gunderson to CTAC Innovations, became a really great opportunity to reflect on the core concepts and fundamental principles that always have been part of the work of Respecting Choices and appropriately reframe them to better describe the depth and the breadth of the work and its impact. And so from the beginning, the ultimate goal of all of the work of Respecting Choices was to know and honor preferences and decisions of individuals. And that goal demands first knowing what matters most, discerned through conversation. It also requires then memorializing that conversation in a way that can be transmitted meaningfully across time, across location, and across multitude of providers or others that need to know. But it also requires being thoughtful about how we actually then educate others to honor those decisions and preferences at the time when the future becomes the present and decisions are actually made. And so that actually is all embedded in this definition of person-centered care, which is from the Institute of Medicine's 2001 publication of Crossing the Quality Chasm, which is care that is respectful of and responsive to individual patient preferences, needs, and values, ensuring that patient values guide all clinical decisions. So I want to pause here and acknowledge, as Amy Berman said last night, words matter. So the first word that I want to talk about is, when do we use person or individual, and when do we use the word patient? And I want to completely respect that there are very many views and vantage points of that, and I think a lot of us care very deeply about how and when we use those words. So I want to describe how we're using them, not to say that it is the one right answer, but just to set a common framework so that you can understand kind of how I'm using them today. So we are always individuals, we are always people. Being a patient is a role that we sometimes are in when we're interacting with healthcare. And so I think when we talk about, in this quote, patient-centered care, in part, I'll say that that's because it is a quote from the IOM and they said patient-centered care. So that's the disclaimer. If it were me, I would tell Don Berwick it actually ought to be person-centered, because I think even when we're in the role of a patient in healthcare, we should always be thought of as a holistic person. So that's my first description of how I intend to be using those words today. And then I will ask for your grace when I slip up. And because I'm a physician, I oftentimes say patient when I know if I were to pause and think about it, I should be saying person. So there are many features of person-centered and family-oriented care. And as Stephanie said this morning, and probably many of you that are working in healthcare are working in organizations that have a lot of initiatives around person-centered care and improving that. And there are many features that very appropriately fit under that more holistic umbrella. We believe that one of the very most important attributes of person-centered care is what we're calling person-centered decision-making, which is an important way that we can engage and support individuals in their family on what really is a journey of a decision-making process that goes all the way from planning for future decisions through the point at which those decisions actually get acted upon and executed. And so Respecting Choices has two programs that address this more holistically. Advanced Care Planning, which is a system for supporting individuals and their families preparing for future healthcare decisions. And then also Shared Decision-Making in Serious Illness, which really focuses on the interaction that happens when the future becomes the present and the decisions need to be acted upon. And it's the dynamic between the provider, which is another word I'll define, physician and or advanced practice nurse or physician assistant. Those of us who are usually in the role of actually writing the orders and making the decisions with our patients. So that dynamic between the provider and the patient, who are both contributing equally important information into the decision so that we come out the other side with a healthcare decision that's aligned with the individual's goals and values. And so advanced care planning and shared decision-making in serious illness then together create that interdisciplinary process that supports individuals and families wherever they are on their decision-making journey, whether they're preparing. And in serious illness in particular, every time we make a decision, it really begets preparing for the next decision. And so it's kind of a continuous cycle. And so if the ultimate outcome of person-centered decision-making is to know and honor, again, it requires creating plans to prepare for the future, which is advanced care planning, making the plans available across time and across locations, and then assuring that those plans are incorporated when the decisions are made is the aspect of shared decision-making, so that we actually keep the promise. And as Jeff mentioned this morning, there are many organizations that make the promise with a 95%, 98% prevalence, but keep the promise 16% of the time. How do we fix that? And that's the shared decision-making aspect of things. So oftentimes when we're developing programs, it's important to have an academic construct. When we're implementing programs, it's important to have diagrams that will describe who's doing what, how the programs interrelate. But I think for today, when we're talking more conceptually, what I really want to do is focus more on a higher level, and I think illustrate this maybe better through a story rather than a diagram. So the story I'm going to share with you is, excuse me, my family story. My mom, when she was 83, had progressive dementia. She also had myelodysplastic syndrome, which is a blood disorder. Hers was manifest with a low platelet count. And platelets are the cells in the blood that help you to clot your blood. So her platelet count was low enough that at that time she was at significant risk for significant and spontaneous catastrophic bleeding. It was amazing that she hadn't had bleeding by that point. And my dad was burdened with worry, wondering, he said, I don't know which disease is going to win. I don't know what this is going to look like. I know that we're at risk for the bottom falling out. I don't know how I'm going to go about making decisions when the time comes, and I know the time will come. And so we arranged for an advanced care planning conversation. And on the other side of that, my dad was so relieved. He now had the ability to put into words what he knew the priorities were, which were to help my mom be free from being afraid, free from having things done to her that she wouldn't understand by people that she didn't know, and free from being in strange surroundings without her family around her. And so he knew that those priorities could be translated into medical goals, even though we didn't know what future decisions were going to come. And those goals he described as avoiding interventions that wouldn't improve her quality of life as she defined it, with examples being avoiding surgery, an ICU stay, or even extensive diagnostic evaluations. So we had prepared for those future decisions, and then the future became the present. When 1 year later, my dad awoke at 2 a.m. to find my mom slowly regaining consciousness on the bathroom floor. Now I'm going to pause in the story and ask you what's going through your head, like what's going to happen next. You probably have a range of possibilities in your mind. And what are the dependencies that change? So tell me what range of possible outcomes now. What's going to happen next?
Well, it almost depends on who he calls first.
Mm-hmm.
Like an ambulance versus the family physician versus a family member.
Can everybody hear? Depends on who you call first, right?
And based on those goals that he had established, that hopefully will inform the next call he makes. I'm kind of hoping he called you first.
Yes.
Even to precede that, what kind of guy is he? Is he the kind of person who, despite all plans, is cool under pressure?
Okay.
Or is he in a panic?
Okay. What else? Yes.
I just have a worry that she was in a pool of blood, unconscious on the floor, which is, I think, the most catastrophic, devastating thing for a family member to have to deal with. So it was even before that. I was like, oh, please tell me she's not a pool of blood. So I don't appreciate you stopping your story.
The tension's killing you. What else? Any other thoughts? Yes.
Some people would start CPR if it wasn't full of blood and the same image.
Sorry?
She said she was just waking up.
Yep, she was just waking up. So what I hear in those is how much responsibility it was on my dad. It's who he called. It's what kind of guy he was. And is that fair? Is that a highly reliable healthcare system that it should all be on him? And I think it's important, and then what I hear in that is it's important to recognize that when the future becomes the present, it oftentimes is a scary time. My dad was afraid, he was sad, he was in emotional pain. And we all need to recognize that it can be comforting to be in the care of a physician who's large and in charge and says, I know what to do. We're going to order platelets, we're going to order a head CT, we'll get neurosurge to see her. Only later to realize in the darkness of the hospital room, listening to a machine beeping, that in retrospect, so many of those things that were done automatically weren't in line with the goals that we had taken time to prepare. Now I'll tell you, that was not our experience. Thankfully and amazingly, it had nothing to do with me. I didn't have to be all doctor-daughter. I could just be the daughter. Instead, when they arrived at the ER, and he did call the primary care physician, who knew my mom best, which was not the hematologist, and they talked about, it probably made sense to go to the hospital to at least figure out what had happened so that we could plan from there. And my dad was a guy who was calm and cool and collected, to the point where when EMS got there and they were about to put in an IV, he said, I don't think so. You know, she doesn't have hardly any platelets. I don't think it's a good idea to poke a hole in her. And the EMS guy said, it's protocol. I have to call my medical director. My dad actually handed him the cell phone. But more importantly, the physician who met my dad in the ER, and there, I'm sure, were staff asking her allergies, her med list, when was she last seen conscious, but the ER physician, before writing an order, started the conversation with my dad by saying, tell me about your wife. And in that one simple statement, she elevated the importance of my dad as being an equal partner in helping to make every decision before she wrote any orders. That's shared decision making. And that's why it's focused on physicians and advanced practitioners, because that's what's required to then honor individuals' preferences. So by asking, tell me about your wife, and then appropriate exploratory questions following that, she tapped into that advanced planning that we had done. She helped him find his voice through the pain and the anguish of, oh my gosh, what's going to happen? And then together, they combined her clinical expertise with what mattered most into agreeing together to proceed with a head CT for prognosis and figuring out what was next. And the head CT did show a significant subdural hematoma with a midline shift. But because of those two things happening together, the advanced planning and the shared decision making, we were able to accomplish an under 12-hour hospital stay with no IV, no futile platelet transfusion, no obligatory neurosurgical consult, because we knew the right thing to do. And we were sad when my mom died about a week later, but we were left without the agony and the grief and the distress of having wondered if we did the right thing. So for planning for the future, the advanced care planning avoided the middle of the night phone call. So if we had not done the advanced care planning but still had that same physician, I think we would have ended up at the same decisions, but it would have been phone calls in the middle of the night and the panic of that. But likewise, if we had done that planning but had a different physician who hadn't started with what matters most, we probably would have been hours and maybe several decisions into the care before we realized, hang on, wait, this isn't what we talked about. This isn't what we want to do. So hopefully that story, yes, Sanders.
Question. So you had done the conversation and the planning in advance for the care, but had you done sort of drill in your mind where you were like, okay, let's do a drill. Mom's on the floor. What are we going to do? Because we act differently when it's
Absolutely. Yep. So that was an interesting journey that I went on as a physician. So as a physician, I have to recognize that That's the way I experience decisions, is they're in front of me. And I hadn't really been in this whole advanced planning thing for very long. And so that's exactly how I started before the ACP conversation. I started by saying, okay, what if it's a GI bleed? What if it's a head bleed? What if it's, a broken hip? And tried to do it, but there's an infinite number of future possible decisions. And so that's why translating the goals into priorities, and then we knew that no matter what of those infinite decisions might come in front of us, we could bump those two up together and know in the moment.
So I'm wondering for family-oriented care, it's sort of tabletop exercises, preparing for a couple of scenarios helps people prepare for dealing with it.
Nope, that's a great thought. It's a great question. Are there other questions? Because I did intend to pause here and ask if that story helped to illustrate the interaction when we talk about advanced care planning versus shared decision making, and how there are different players that have different roles, but all operating off of that one patient story that wraps around individuals and their families.
So what happens in a situation where the original primary care provider is not available and it is an emergency? I mean, you highlighted the importance of the family. But, I mean, I've been in situations with family members where the original primary care provider was not available, and so that instant access to that information is not there. So you have to rely on the family, and maybe they're not so cool under those circumstances.
Right. And that's where I think that, again, it's not a philosophy of care that can be relegated to one specialty or one clinician in the whole team aspect. I think it requires that all of us, whether we're primary care or an ER physician or the neurosurgeon, start with, tell me what matters most. Have you had these conversations before? And doing that goal discernment before starting off with outlining the 4 or 5 options that there are, the risks, benefits of each, and now what do you want to do? That we really all have to start with what matters most to help people who have planned find their voice and have the confidence to express their voice, because by asking that question, we're telegraphing that matters to us and that we believe that's half of decision making. The clinical stuff is only the other half. So it's like do everything everywhere. The work will never be done. Yes, Linda.
And if the ER physician validated the role of the husband,
Yep.
by asking, then the husband your dad could say, oh yeah, he was supported. So
Right.
She validated that approach in a very simple way, didn't she? It changed this whole thought process.
Yes.
So as a social worker who's worked in different settings, what I'll often see is the challenges come up when there's a disconnect between either the doctor is disagreeing in some way with what the family is saying the priorities are, or the family is disagreeing with the doctor for whatever reason. And when the family disagrees, it's often that the doctor is advocating or maybe suggesting that less care would be the better decision because more care wouldn't be as effective, and the family is wanting more care. And then, so I'm just curious what you've observed and studied in terms of how it helps with those dynamics. I have my own thoughts about it, but
So I would say that in the shared decision in SDMSI, shared decision making in serious illness program that we're offering, it's an implementation that includes all the same strategies that you guys are familiar with implementing advanced care planning, and it has a curriculum for physicians. And in that curriculum, we purposefully don't start with communication skills. We start with self-reflection. What do you think your role is as a physician? What are your biases? And it's important to acknowledge that we all have biases. Having a bias isn't wrong. If you think you don't have biases, you're not being honest with yourself, because we all develop biases because that's shaped by our behavior. So palliative care physicians have a very different bias than an ER physician. And that's okay as long as we know it and exercise the practice of setting it aside when we're engaging in conversations with individuals and families so that we can really hear them and not filter it. And so I don't know if that answered your question, but that it's important to do that critical thinking as part of the training. And so we don't focus, I mean, yes, communication skills are critically important, and so is the structure of the conversation and the order in which it happens, but doing that self-analysis and self-awareness is an absolute critical part of this. And even reflecting on how do we as clinicians make decisions, as opposed to, I had one physician that went through the class, he was a gastroenterologist, and he said, I know how I make decisions, I can articulate that all day long. He said, I never actually thought about how patients make decisions. So it's pretty foundational, fundamental work, but it is such a blast when the light bulbs go on and feel like we're really making a difference one doc at a time.
Yeah, sorry. What I observe is that so often, I talk to my patients about this all the time, is that, so often we're having the what can we do conversation in
Yes.
the hospital, but we need to be having the what should we do conversation. And this model deliberately shifts the providers away from the what can we do and helps us be less tied to outcomes. I think sometimes we get so invested in things going a certain way with the case because that's what we know best or that's what we think is best. But if we're just focused on listening and understanding where the patient and family are coming from, then that actually frees us to actually maybe even think more flexibly about what the outcomes could be.
Absolutely.
And instead of just kind of getting on this conveyor belt,
And to the conveyor belt comment, I've always been impressed how many times we head down a glide path and we don't, the decisions that we're making are like invisible. It's like we don't recognize that there's an incrementalism in that decision making, and that's when you end up at day 41 of an ICU stay and you say, how did we get here? It's a day of decision making at a time, and so that would be the other thing to elevate is how many decisions are oftentimes implied when we really have a chance to pause and actually make a purposeful decision. So, any other questions or comments? So that's sort of unpacked the evolution in our language, how this always has been the work that Respecting Choices has been involved with. We're now finding a better way to articulate the aspects of advanced care planning and shared decision making. And now I want to reflect on how all of this together can actually transform the culture of healthcare. So cultural change is challenging, and although, I love this quote, although talk about person-centered care is ubiquitous, it's everywhere in modern healthcare, one of the greatest challenges of turning rhetoric into reality continues to be routinely engaging patients in decision-making. And so if I say this whole movement is cultural change, I think it's important to start by saying, what is culture? How would you define culture? Because you have to know what it is that you're trying to change before you can actually have a meaningful conversation about that. So how would you, does anybody have a definition of culture that they like?
Fallback behavior.
A fallback behavior. Sanders? Sorry? The way we do things. The attitudes of the environment. Yep. Values and priorities. Yep. So one of my favorite definitions that actually Linda introduced me to is culture is the definition of what is acceptable behavior in an organization. It's not elusive or intangible, but it's a specific component of a delivery system that has to be managed as much as any other part of a system. And so first is believing that it can be managed. And so what does it take to move from a culture driven by a primary goal of treating and managing diseases and injuries to a culture that's driven by person-centered, family-oriented care where patient values or person values guide all clinical decisions? And so I like this model in trying to unpack how does culture work and how can leadership, what is leadership's role in shifting a culture? So I first became familiar with this diagram, which is deceptive in its simplicity, when at Spectrum Health the organization decided that it really wanted to improve patient safety. And so we saw the results that we didn't like and knew what behaviors could change those results. But the leaders at that time were wise enough to recognize it really was a cultural transformation that needed to happen, and they actually were willing to call the whole initiative Safety Culture Transformation. And so they recognized that it was deep and it was wide and it needed to be all in. Interestingly, when we then were launching our person-centered care, advanced care planning, and person-centered decision-making, the leaders at that time wanted to focus on the results and the behavior. They said there's training, we can have people go through mandatory education and sort of operated just in those upper two layers, and somehow didn't see the importance of going deep and wide. So that's one question I'm going to plant for you to think about. And I want to come back to that, and Jeff, I would especially love your input on why is it that healthcare organizations are, with what I'll call the traditional things like patient safety, why they're willing to view it as cultural change. Yet when we talk about person-centered care or all of what we're talking about here, there's such a temptation to focus on education and training alone. Because I have a bias, but I would love to have other people's input on that. So I think focusing on the results and behavior is focusing on what's visible. And so I like to think of this more analogous to an iceberg, where really it's the mass beneath the surface that's invisible that buoys up and supports what's visible above the waterline. So recognizing that all of us, our behavior is driven by what we believe to be acceptable. And what we believe to be acceptable and appropriate is shaped by our experiences. So can anybody think about what leadership activities or strategies could be implemented that could help shift the belief structure through experiences of your workforce as you want them to adopt the new desired behaviors that support person-centered care? Sorry? Tell stories, right? Yep.
Have your leaders go through advanced care planning conversations themselves.
Okay, so shaping the leaders' experiences, for sure, yes.
We have a hospitalist group in our state that, in addition to training and whatnot, they actually have newer physicians shadow physicians who completely adopted this approach.
Mm-hmm.
And so they get to see the conversations, and they're in the room, and they get to see the struggle and the way that the physicians carry on the conversations, what's the outcome of it. So they, beyond the stories, they get to experience it themselves and their own experiences.
Mm-hmm.
The benefits of it.
I would think the experience of having to answer to not having honored some decisions would transform.
Mm-hmm. 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 And so I'll share with you one example from when I was at Spectrum Health. When we were launching this initiative among the physicians in the cardiovascular area, the department chief kicked it off by having an evening dinner that was catered for all of his physicians, and he shared his personal journey of how he moved from the way physicians have traditionally been trained and practiced into the amazing personal and professional satisfaction he derived by shifting his beliefs. And there are other examples that I'm probably going to skip in the interest of time because Britt's already flashed me. And so really what you can think about, though, is that these experiences created by leaders is what people see when we walk the walk. Because it's leaders that decide what's measured, what gets recognized, what gets rewarded. Those shape people's belief structure in what really is important and valued by your organization. And that can be true of leaders at any level in an organization. In addition to walking the walk, obviously it's important to inspire a shared vision, which is the talking of the talk. But then again, examples of people are watching. Do you hold yourself accountable as a leader in the organization, in addition to when people don't follow what we're expecting of them, how that's handled. Are you present to help remove barriers and really investing of your time and resources for the success? And so leading by example truly does function to shift people's belief structure in what's important. And signs of cultural transformation are there if you look for them. So to carry the glacier analogy forward, or the iceberg analogy forward, I would say cultural transformation sometimes feels like it happens at a glacial pace. And so you do need to look for it and elevate it when you're seeing signs of it. So as an example, again, back at Spectrum Health, we had a heart failure readmission reduction program where initially there would be weekly huddles where there would be the primary care physician and the cardiologist and the care manager on the phone talking about every patient that was readmitted with heart failure. And before we started this work, the focus was on how the patient was non-compliant. They weren't doing what we said. I'll blame the patient, I call it, and all the more services that we just needed to pile on. The cultural transformation was manifest when people started saying, hang on, is this our plan or the patient's plan? And people started asking questions like, is coming back to the hospital what the patient's goals are? Is that in line with the patient's goals? So it is possible to look for it, and it is possible to transform a culture, but it requires a plan, and it's helpful to think about going deep and wide to know how to have that happen. So person-centered decision-making, advanced care planning, and shared decision-making together, creating a process to engage and support individuals through their journey of the decision-making process is really what's required to keep the commitment of all 5 promises and ensuring that individuals' values guide all clinical decisions. So with that, I think my time is, we have 5 more minutes for questions. Any questions, reflections? Was this helpful to go a little bit deeper in the evolution of our language and our concepts as we move forward? Yes?
I really appreciate that triangle, the iceberg analogy. I can really see the ways where some parts of where we're getting stuck in our organization is that we are really focused on those observable changes, and we're not really examining those beliefs and experiences. And so I'm looking forward to bringing that back.
Yeah, and examining the beliefs and that's where you really find the misaligned incentives. And you got to figure out how to address those and what trumps. Sanders.
I'll add to that line of beliefs is assumptions.
Uh-huh.
So below the surface, the beliefs and assumptions are, we don't even think of them, they're just part of what we are.
Right.
And so if a leader sort of shining a light on beliefs and assumptions, maybe challenging them or the story, making people aware of the things they just assume.
Yep. Self-awareness is so important in this work because otherwise beliefs unexamined can't be changed. Mm-hmm. I saw another hand over. Yeah.
Question, because our ICUs have started doing the little rounds, everybody meets in a huddle outside of the rooms, and they're all proud and happy about that. We've been doing it for over a year. Great, but then just a note that just says interdisciplinary team meeting and the names, nothing about what happened.
Oh.
And so I work with palliative care in our large health system, and so one of our providers, Try, is able to go to the rounds depending on census and consult set up. But I always ask myself, as a social worker, I'm going to go into these meetings, these little rounds, but who's checking in of whose plan is this? You brought a really good point. Do you have any tips or suggestions, knowing that it's very time limited? They're doing, 17
Yes.
beds and
Right.
multiple ICUs on each floor.
Mm-hmm.
The best way for them to check in of whose plan this is, like, should there be a specific stakeholder? And I know part of that is the culture change, but that's going to take time.
Mm-hmm.
But even just
Mm-hmm. So I think it's incredibly honest to say, like, who's asking the patient? Like, Yeah, we should. I mean, fundamentally, we should all be patient advocates, but we do have to hold ourselves accountable to ensuring that that happens. And so the example I would use is that, again, at Spectrum, they have what they call Heart Team, which you can think of as analogous to a tumor board, where all the cardiologists, they'll bring complex high-risk cases, and all the various subspecialties of cardiology are cloistered in a room. They look at the labs, the evidence, the data, the images, and make a opine and make a recommendation on the right treatment to offer the patient. And as another sign of our cultural transformation, those physicians are now find that morally unacceptable, and they are demanding on figuring out some process to bring the patient voice into that mixture. Yeah, and so they actually are going to be applying for a PCORI grant to fund a study to look at developing a process where it'll probably at least start with members of the advanced care planning team to have a discerning what matters most and bring that in as equally important information into that clinical discussion, and then also designate someone to go and then present the options a little bit differently than what's been done in the past to the patient and family. So thinking about a mechanism to, how can you bring that patient voice in to, and
Especially as me, who's not physically there.
right.
Knowing until culture change really happens, and that's what we're striving for, but in the immediate present,
Yep.
how to keep hearing their voice in these 5-minute rounds outside of the room, like, talk about the person like
Yeah.
piece of furniture.
And maybe that isn't the right place or the right time to bring it in, but to figure out how can, and so, what worked well for us was to create the moral distress of the physicians to start realizing, wait, this doesn't feel okay anymore. And then they'll figure out a way to bring it in. Yes. Yes. Yep. Schwartz Center rounds, I don't know if you want to say a little bit more about that. Are people familiar with Schwartz Center rounds? Yeah. Good, that's time. Okay, thank you.